Sometimes I think we made a mistake having her, Richard Carter said, not lowering his voice, not checking whether his daughter was still within earshot, and the words hung over the Sunday dinner table like something that could not be taken back. Emily Carter was 28 years old when she heard her father say that, standing just beyond the kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in her hands, the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filling the air as if this were any ordinary family evening in suburban Ohio. Susan Carter did not correct him. She did not even look surprised. She simply took a sip of iced tea and stared at her plate as though the comment were about the weather, and that silence was what hollowed Emily out more than anything else. For a moment she thought she might have misunderstood, that maybe he was talking about the timing of something, about money, about a house they almost bought years ago. But then he added, quieter this time yet somehow sharper, we weren't ready. We gave up a lot, and Susan nodded once, a small motion that felt heavier than a slammed door. Emily did not walk back into the dining room. She did not argue or demand an explanation. She folded the towel carefully, placed it on the counter, and went upstairs to the bedroom she had slept in since high school, the walls still painted a pale blue she had chosen at 16. The house was 2,400 square feet of memories, birthday cakes, science fair posters, framed report cards on the hallway wall, and suddenly none of it felt like it belonged to her. She sat on the edge of her full-sized bed, the mattress dipping slightly in the middle, and listened to the muffled clink of silverware downstairs as her parents continued eating. 28 years. That was how long she had tried to be the easy child, the grateful one, the daughter who didn't ask for much. She remembered turning down a job offer in Seattle 2 years earlier because her mother had hinted that moving so far would be hard on the family. She remembered driving 45 minutes every Sunday after church to have dinner with them, bringing dessert from the bakery on Main Street because it made her father smile. She remembered staying home from a spring break trip in college to help when her mother had minor surgery, sleeping on a recliner in the hospital room for 3 nights straight. None of those memories rose up in anger now, they simply passed through her mind like pages turning too quickly. Emily opened her closet and pulled down her old navy suitcase from the top shelf. The zipper made a long, steady sound in the quiet room. She packed methodically, 2 pairs of jeans, 3 blouses, her gray cardigan, toiletries from the bathroom. She did not take the framed family photos from her dresser. She left behind the porcelain jewelry box her grandmother had given her at 15. On her desk lay a thick spiral notebook bound in dark green, its edges softened from years of handling. It was her diary, something she had started at 17 when she first noticed how often her parents compared her to other people's children, how frequently her achievements were followed by a "but." She ran her fingers over the cover, then opened to a blank page and wrote in neat, steady handwriting, "If they ever wonder why I left, the answers have always been here." Downstairs, chairs scraped against hardwood floors. A faucet ran. The television clicked on. Life continued as usual. Emily closed the notebook, set it deliberately in the center of her desk, and zipped her suitcase shut. She did not slam the door when she carried it down the stairs. She paused at the bottom, listening to the familiar voices in the living room, then stepped out into the cool evening air without saying goodbye, leaving behind the only home she had ever known and the words that would finally make her parents see what their silence had cost. The house felt unusually large the morning after Emily left, as if the walls had shifted outward overnight and created distance where there had once been routine. Susan was the first to notice the quiet. She stood in the kitchen at 7 o'clock, pouring coffee into the same ceramic mug she had used for years, and waited for the soft thud of footsteps descending the stairs. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. The refrigerator hummed. No one came. Richard walked in wearing his usual pressed slacks and button-down shirt, already prepared for work, and asked without looking up from his phone whether Emily was running late. Susan hesitated before answering that she had not heard her leave for church, which was strange because Emily never missed a Sunday. Richard shrugged and said she was 28 years old, not a teenager, as if independence explained absence. It was only when Susan carried a basket of folded laundry upstairs and pushed open the bedroom door that the air seemed to thin in her lungs. The bed was made. The closet doors were slightly open, revealing empty hangers swaying gently in the draft from the vent. The navy suitcase that had always rested on the top shelf was gone. On the desk, centered with unsettling precision, lay the dark green notebook. Susan set the laundry down slowly and walked toward it as though approaching something fragile. She did not call Richard right away. Instead she sat in the desk chair and placed her hand on the cover, noticing the worn edges, the faint impression of years pressed into paper. Downstairs, a car engine started in the driveway next door, the ordinary rhythm of suburban life continuing without pause. Susan opened the notebook to the first page she saw, expecting teenage complaints, dramatic entries about curfews or college applications. The handwriting was steady, careful, almost restrained. The date at the top was from 10 years earlier. "Dad said I should be grateful they did not ask for more from me," the line read. "I am trying to understand what more I am supposed to become." Susan felt something tighten in her chest. She flipped forward. "Mom told Aunt Linda that I was an unexpected responsibility. I pretended not to hear." Another page. "I got the scholarship today. They said congratulations, then asked if I would still stay close to home." The entries were not angry. They were quiet observations, the kind that did not accuse but did not forget. Each sentence was short, factual, as if Emily had been recording weather patterns instead of emotions. Richard's footsteps sounded on the stairs at last. He appeared in the doorway, confusion giving way to irritation when he saw Susan sitting there. He asked where Emily had gone, and Susan did not answer immediately. She simply turned the notebook toward him and said he should read. He took it with a faint scoff that faded as his eyes moved across the page. The room seemed smaller now, the pale blue walls pressing inward. Outside, a lawn mower started. Somewhere down the block. Richard read silently, his jaw tightening not in anger but in recognition. There were entries about Sunday dinners, about the drive she made every week without being asked, about declining the job offer in Seattle because she overheard Susan worrying about distance. There were lines about wanting to feel chosen, not tolerated. At the very back of the notebook, written the night before, was a final sentence: "If I leave quietly, maybe they will finally hear me." Richard lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping in the same place it had the night before when Emily packed. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The house remained still, filled with the evidence of a daughter who had not shouted, had not argued, but had documented everything. And for the first time in years, the silence did not feel comfortable. It felt earned. Richard did not go to work that morning. He remained seated on the edge of Emily's bed long after Susan left the room, the green notebook resting heavily in his hands as though it weighed more than paper should. The house carried on with its usual sounds, the heating system clicking on, a delivery truck pausing briefly at the neighbor's mailbox, yet everything felt slightly misaligned, like furniture shifted a few inches out of place. He turned another page and found an entry dated 5 years earlier, the year Emily had graduated from college. "Dad asked if my degree would actually lead to something practical," she had written. "I smiled and said yes. I did not tell him I already had an offer in another state because I knew he would say family comes first." Richard remembered that conversation. He had been standing in the driveway, leaning against his truck, proud but cautious, worried about tuition loans and long-distance moves. He had told himself he was being realistic, not dismissive. Now, reading her words, he saw how easily practicality could sound like disappointment. Downstairs, Susan sat at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her, staring at Emily's contact photo, a simple headshot taken at Thanksgiving 2 years ago. She pressed call once and held the phone to her ear, listening to the steady ring before it went to voicemail. She did not leave a message. She tried again 10 minutes later with the same result. The silence on the other end felt deliberate, not angry, but resolved. Richard eventually joined her, placing the notebook between them like evidence in a case neither wanted to argue. Susan began reading from the middle, her voice quiet. There were entries about small moments she had forgotten, comments made casually while cooking or driving, comparisons to other families whose children had moved away and visited less often. "Mom said at least I still live nearby," one entry read. "I wonder if nearby is the only reason I matter." Susan covered her mouth with her hand, remembering how she had once said that line to a friend on the phone, thinking it harmless. Neither of them had realized how carefully Emily listened, how thoroughly she absorbed every remark. The final pages described the past year in greater detail. Emily had written about feeling like a guest in conversations about future plans, about noticing how her parents discussed retirement and travel without ever asking where she imagined herself living in 5 years. "They talk about what they gave up," she wrote. "I do not think they see what I have chosen to give." Richard stood and walked to the front window, watching a jogger pass by on the sidewalk. He thought about the job offer in Seattle that he had once dismissed as too far, about how he had joked that Ohio was good enough for anyone who valued family. He had believed that stability meant staying close, that loyalty meant proximity measured in miles rather than understanding. The house around him suddenly felt less like a symbol of sacrifice and more like a place that had quietly narrowed his daughter's world. Susan finally left a voicemail in a careful, steady tone, telling Emily that they had read the notebook and that they were thinking of her. She did not apologize directly. The words seemed too small for what she was beginning to understand. Richard returned to the table and opened to the last page once more. "If I leave quietly, maybe they will finally hear me," the sentence read again, unchanged but heavier now. He realized that Emily had not slammed doors or raised her voice because she had spent years documenting instead of debating, observing instead of accusing. Her departure was not an impulse. It was a conclusion. The realization settled over both of them with uncomfortable clarity. 4. The first time, they were not wondering where she had gone physically. They were confronting how long ago she had begun to distance herself emotionally, step by careful step, page by page, while they were still convinced that everything inside their home was steady and secure. Emily drove west for nearly 3 hours before she allowed herself to stop, the Ohio state line shrinking in her rearview mirror as if distance could soften what she had heard and what she had finally understood. She kept both hands steady on the steering wheel of her silver sedan, the gas tank half full, her suitcase lying flat in the trunk with room to spare. The highway stretched ahead in long, straight lines bordered by late summer cornfields, green and tall, swaying under a pale sky. She did not turn on the radio. She let the silence remain, not heavy but clarifying. In her mind, she replayed the image of the green notebook resting on her desk, positioned carefully where it could not be ignored. She had not left a note taped to the refrigerator or sent a dramatic message. She had left documentation, years of quiet evidence that she had tried, adjusted, and accommodated more than anyone had realized. By the time she reached a small town outside Indianapolis, she pulled into a modest roadside hotel with a brick exterior and a glowing vacancy sign. The room cost $89 plus tax, and the clerk at the front desk barely glanced up as she handed over her identification. The room was simple, with a queen-sized bed, a wooden dresser, and a window overlooking a parking lot lit by tall white lamps. Emily set her suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the unfamiliar firmness of a mattress that did not dip in the middle. For the first time since leaving, she allowed herself to exhale fully. She checked her phone. 2 missed calls from her mother. 1 voicemail. She listened to it slowly. Susan's voice sounded measured, almost cautious, saying they had read the notebook and that they were thinking of her. There was no anger in the message. There was something else, something closer to realization, but it was still incomplete. Emily did not delete the voicemail. She set the phone down and looked around the small room, taking in the neutral painting on the wall and the faint scent of laundry detergent from the sheets. She opened her email and reread the message she had received 3 weeks earlier from a marketing firm in Chicago confirming her interview for a position she had once hesitated to pursue. She had almost declined it, telling herself that moving several states away would complicate Sunday dinners and holiday routines. Now, sitting alone in a hotel room measured in square feet instead of memories, she understood that her life could not be anchored to conversations that left her feeling optional. Back in Ohio, Richard walked through the house that evening noticing details he had overlooked for years. The hallway felt longer. The framed photographs on the wall seemed to document a childhood that had progressed quietly toward departure. He paused at one picture taken when Emily was 12, holding a science fair ribbon with a small, hopeful smile. He tried to remember what he had said that day. He could not recall his exact words, only that he had been distracted by work deadlines. Susan remained at the kitchen table long after sunset, the green notebook closed but within reach. She read through the final pages again, this time more slowly, tracing the lines with her finger as if repetition might offer a different outcome. The house was still intact, every piece of furniture in its place, yet the certainty that had once filled it had shifted. Miles away, in a hotel room lit by a single bedside lamp, Emily opened her laptop and began updating her resume, adding details she had minimized before, listing achievements without apology. She was not running from home in anger. She was moving towards something she had postponed. The distance between them was no longer measured only in miles. It was measured in awareness, in the quiet recognition that staying had cost her more than leaving ever would. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the hotel room as Emily woke before her alarm, her mind alert even before her eyes fully opened. For a few seconds she forgot where she was, expecting to see the pale blue walls of her childhood bedroom, but instead she saw a neutral beige ceiling and heard the distant hum of traffic from the interstate. The unfamiliarity did not frighten her. It steadied her. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and noticed another voicemail from her mother sent late the night before. This one was longer. Susan's voice sounded less controlled, less measured. She said they had kept reading, that they had not realized how many small comments had accumulated over the years. She admitted that perhaps they had spoken carelessly about sacrifices and readiness without understanding how those words might settle in their daughter's heart. She did not ask Emily to come home immediately. She simply said they wanted to listen, if Emily was willing to speak. Emily sat up slowly, letting the words replay. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet evaluation. Apologies, she understood, were not proven by tone but by change. She set the phone down and opened her laptop once more, confirming the address of the marketing firm in downtown Chicago where she had an interview scheduled in 2 days. The office was located in a glass building overlooking the river, nearly 300 miles from the street where she had grown up. The distance felt significant but not impossible. She showered, dressed in one of the blouses she had packed, and checked out of the hotel before 8:30, stopping at a nearby coffee shop for a large cup of black coffee and a breakfast sandwich wrapped in paper. She sat by the window, watching commuters hurry past with briefcases and backpacks, each person moving toward a destination that made sense to them. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life that was not arranged around Sunday dinners or proximity to her parents' expectations. Back in Ohio, Richard and Susan sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the green notebook open between them once again. They had both slept poorly, waking at intervals to thoughts they could no longer dismiss. Richard spoke first, admitting that he had often measured success in practical terms, in steady jobs and nearby addresses, and that he had mistaken his own comfort for what was best for their daughter. Susan confessed that she had repeated phrases about timing and readiness without realizing that a child might interpret those words as regret rather than reflection. They did not argue. They did not defend themselves. Instead, they began recalling moments that now seemed different under this new light. The day Emily had turned down the Seattle offer, she had smiled and said it was not the right time. They had accepted that answer without asking whether it was truly hers. The many Sundays she had arrived with dessert in hand, they had praised her reliability but never questioned whether she felt obligated. The pattern emerged slowly but unmistakably. Emily had adjusted herself to fit their comfort, and they had assumed that adjustment was natural. Richard finally picked up his phone and typed a message carefully, deleting and rewriting it twice before sending. He told Emily that they were proud of her, not only for her achievements but for the courage it must have taken to leave without shouting. He acknowledged that they had spoken about sacrifice too freely and had failed to recognize what she had sacrificed in return. He did not demand that she come back. He wrote that they hoped to earn a place in her life, wherever she chose to build it. When the message delivered, he set the phone down and exhaled slowly. In the coffee shop nearly 300 miles away, Emily felt her phone vibrate against the wooden table. She read her father's words once, then again, noting the difference in tone, the absence of excuses. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she folded the paper from her sandwich neatly and placed it in the trash, finished her coffee, and stood to leave. Outside, the morning air carried a faint chill, signaling the approach of fall. She walked to her car with a steady pace, aware that reconciliation, if it happened, would unfold gradually. What mattered now was that her departure had finally shifted the conversation. For years she had been present yet unheard. Now, in her absence, her voice carried further than it ever had within the walls of her childhood home. Emily arrived in Chicago just before sunset, the skyline rising ahead of her in clean lines of glass and steel, reflecting a sky washed in pale orange. The city felt larger than anything she had known, louder and yet strangely anonymous, as if it did not care who she had been yesterday. She checked into a small extended-stay apartment she had reserved for 1 week, a modest unit on the 15th floor with a narrow balcony overlooking a busy intersection. From that height, the traffic lights changed in steady patterns and the sound of car horns softened into a distant hum. She placed her suitcase against the wall and walked slowly through the space, touching the kitchen counter, opening the empty refrigerator, standing in the doorway of the bedroom as if confirming that this was real. Nearly 300 miles away, her parents were finishing dinner in a kitchen that suddenly felt too quiet without the familiar Sunday routine. Richard glanced at his phone more often than he intended, hoping for a reply that did not come. Susan had placed the green notebook back on Emily's desk upstairs, not hidden away but not displayed either, as if it now represented something sacred rather than accusatory. In Chicago, Emily sat on the edge of her new bed and reread her father's message. The words were careful, stripped of the defensiveness she had grown accustomed to hearing in conversations about sacrifice and responsibility. She considered responding with something simple, something neutral, but instead she opened her email and confirmed her interview time for 10 o'clock the following morning. Preparation felt more urgent than reconciliation. She laid out her navy blazer, pressed her blouse, and reviewed notes about the company's recent campaigns. Each practical step grounded her further in the present. When her phone vibrated again, she expected another message from home, but it was a reminder about the interview location and parking instructions. She realized that for the first time in years, her schedule was not built around maintaining harmony. It was built around possibility. Back in Ohio, Richard walked upstairs and paused outside the bedroom that still carried traces of his daughter's presence. He stepped inside and sat at the desk where the notebook had once been centered. The surface was now bare, almost formal. He imagined Emily in a room somewhere else, preparing for something they had once encouraged in theory but hesitated to support in practice. He understood now that pride expressed too cautiously could feel like doubt. Susan joined him quietly, standing near the doorway. They did not speak about forcing her to return. Instead, they discussed practical changes, the kind that could demonstrate growth rather than regret. They agreed that if Emily chose to stay in Chicago, they would visit on her terms, not as supervisors but as guests. They spoke about learning to ask questions instead of making assumptions, about listening without immediately measuring answers against their own expectations. In the apartment high above the Chicago street, Emily stepped onto the small balcony and looked out at the river reflecting city lights. The wind lifted her hair slightly, cool and steady. She did not feel anger. She felt clarity. The distance had not erased the past, but it had given her perspective. She understood that love without awareness could still wound, and that leaving had been less about punishment and more about preservation. As night settled over both cities, two households adjusted to a new understanding. In one, parents confronted the weight of words spoken too casually. In the other, a daughter prepared to step into a room where she would be evaluated not as an obligation or an extension of someone else's choices, but as herself. The miles between them remained, but the silence had changed its meaning. It was no longer avoidance. It was space, and within that space, something different had the chance to grow. Emily woke before her alarm on the morning of her interview, the city already alive beyond the 15th floor window, sunlight reflecting off the river in sharp lines that reached into her apartment. She stood for a moment with her hands resting on the kitchen counter, breathing in the unfamiliar quiet of a space that held no history, no expectations attached to it. She dressed carefully in her navy blazer and pressed blouse, smoothing the fabric as if preparing not only for a meeting but for a different version of herself. The elevator ride down felt longer than it was, filled with strangers who did not know her name or her past, and that anonymity felt strangely freeing. Outside, the air carried a crisp edge, the kind that hinted at early fall. She walked 3 blocks to the glass office building, heels steady against the sidewalk, rehearsing not apologies or explanations but qualifications, experience, ideas she had once softened when speaking at home. Nearly 300 miles away, Richard stood in the driveway holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, watching the street as though expecting something to appear at the end of it. He had taken the day off work, telling himself there were tasks around the house that needed attention, though none of them felt urgent. Inside, Susan folded laundry slowly, her mind returning again and again to the image of Emily at 12 years old holding that science fair ribbon. She remembered the exact shade of the ribbon, a deep blue, and the way Emily had waited for feedback that was never fully expressed. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It settled gradually, like dust becoming visible in direct sunlight. In Chicago, Emily sat across from 2 interviewers in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. They asked about her previous projects, about leadership, about long-term goals. For the first time, she spoke without filtering her ambitions through the lens of proximity to home. She described strategies she had researched, campaigns she had conceptualized, and her interest in relocating permanently if the opportunity aligned with her growth. Her voice remained calm, measured, and certain. She did not mention sacrifice. She did not mention regret. She spoke as someone who understood her own value. When the interview concluded, one of the executives shook her hand firmly and said they would be in touch within a few days. Emily stepped back onto the sidewalk with a sense of clarity rather than anxiety. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. A message from her father appeared on the screen, short but sincere. He wrote that he hoped her meeting went well and that he was proud of her for pursuing it. There was no suggestion that she should reconsider, no reminder of distance or inconvenience. She read the message twice before typing a response. She thanked him and said the interview had gone well. She did not promise to come home soon. She did not offer a timeline. She simply shared a fact and allowed it to stand. Back in Ohio, Richard felt his shoulders lower slightly when he saw her reply. It was brief, but it was not silence. He showed Susan the message, and for the first time since she left, they both allowed a small, cautious relief to surface. They understood that rebuilding would not happen through grand declarations. It would happen through consistency, through restraint, through learning to celebrate her steps even when those steps led away from them. That evening, Emily returned to her apartment and stood once more on the narrow balcony, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. She thought about the notebook she had left behind, about the years recorded in careful handwriting. She realized that those pages had not been written to accuse but to clarify. She had needed to see her own thoughts laid out in ink before she could act on them. Now, with the skyline before her and the echo of professional affirmation still steady in her mind, she understood that distance did not erase family. It redefined it. In Ohio, Richard and Susan sat side by side on the living room couch without the television on, speaking quietly about changes they would need to make not to bring her back but to become parents worthy of being visited. The miles between Chicago and Ohio remained the same, measured in highway signs and gas stations, but the understanding on both sides had shifted. And in that shift, something that had once felt like an ending began to resemble the beginning of a different, more honest connection. 3 days later, Emily was sitting at the small kitchen table in her Chicago apartment when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She let it ring twice before answering, her voice steady as she said hello. The hiring manager from the marketing firm spoke with a warm, professional tone and informed her that they were offering her the position, with a starting salary that was higher than she had expected and a relocation stipend to help with long-term housing. Emily listened carefully, asked a few thoughtful questions about the start date and responsibilities, and then accepted. When the call ended, she remained seated for a moment, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. The offer did not feel like triumph over anyone. It felt like alignment, as if something she had postponed for years had finally been allowed to move forward. She walked to the window and looked down at the intersection 15 floors below, watching people cross the street in steady lines. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine signing a lease, buying furniture that had never belonged to anyone else, building routines that were chosen rather than inherited. In Ohio, Richard was mowing the lawn when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He turned off the mower and wiped his hands on a cloth before checking the screen. Emily's name appeared in a text message notification. He opened it slowly, aware that every exchange now carried weight. She wrote that she had been offered the position and had accepted it, and that she would be staying in Chicago permanently. The message was clear and composed. There was no apology attached to it, no request for permission. Richard read it twice before walking back inside where Susan was preparing dinner. He handed her the phone without speaking. Susan read the message, then placed the phone carefully on the counter as if it were fragile. They stood there in the kitchen that had once felt like the center of their daughter's weekly routine and understood that the geography of their family had changed. That evening, they did not argue about what could have been done differently. They did not suggest that she reconsider. Instead, Richard typed a response telling Emily how proud they were of her accomplishment and how much confidence it must have taken to step into a new city alone. Susan added a separate message a few minutes later, telling her daughter that they would visit when she felt ready and that they wanted to learn about her new life rather than pull her back into the old one. In Chicago, Emily read both messages while standing in the elevator returning from a quick trip to the grocery store. She noticed the difference in language. There was no mention of distance being too far, no hint that her decision created inconvenience. There was recognition. She replied with a simple thank you and told them she would call on Sunday evening to talk more. When Sunday arrived, the call lasted nearly an hour. The conversation moved slowly at first, polite and cautious, but gradually shifted into something more open. Emily described the office building, the view of the river, the feeling of walking into a room where her ideas were welcomed without comparison. Richard listened without interrupting. Susan asked questions about neighborhoods and grocery stores, about the weather near the lake. They did not insert stories about what they had given up. They focused on what she was building. When the call ended, there was no dramatic reconciliation, no grand declaration that everything had been resolved. There was simply a shared understanding that love required adjustment, and that adjustment sometimes began with distance. In her apartment, Emily set her phone down and looked around at the space that was gradually becoming home. The silence that followed the call no longer felt heavy. It felt balanced, as if for the first time, she could exist in her own life without shrinking to fit someone else's narrative. And in Ohio, her parents sat together on the couch, aware that their daughter's absence had not broken their family. It had revealed what needed to change. 6 months after moving to Chicago, Emily stood in the center of her new one-bedroom apartment surrounded by half-assembled furniture and open boxes, sunlight pouring in through wide windows that overlooked the river. She had signed a 12-month lease in a neighborhood filled with coffee shops, bookstores, and quiet tree-lined streets, a place that felt intentional rather than temporary. The marketing firm had quickly become more than a job. She had led her first campaign within 3 months, presenting ideas in a conference room where her voice carried without hesitation. Her salary allowed her to furnish her space slowly, choosing a solid oak dining table instead of accepting hand-me-downs, selecting artwork that reflected her own taste rather than matching someone else's decor. On a crisp Saturday morning in early October, her phone buzzed with a message from her mother confirming flight details. Richard and Susan were coming to visit for the weekend. The decision had not been rushed. They had asked weeks earlier whether it would be convenient, and Emily had chosen the date herself. When she arrived at O'Hare International Airport to meet them, she noticed how small the distance between gates felt compared to the emotional miles they had traveled. Susan spotted her first and waved, her expression open, not anxious. Richard followed with a tentative smile that carried both pride and humility. There were no dramatic embraces, only a steady hug that lasted a little longer than usual. As they drove back into the city, Emily pointed out landmarks, describing where she worked, where she liked to walk along the water in the evenings. Her parents listened without interrupting, asking questions about her team, her projects, her favorite restaurants. They did not mention what they had once believed she owed them. In her apartment, sunlight illuminated the space she had built from scratch. Richard ran his hand along the edge of the oak table and said it suited her. Susan stood by the window, looking out at the river and remarking that the view was beautiful. That evening, they walked to a nearby restaurant and sat outside under string lights, the air cool but comfortable. Conversation moved easily, not because the past had disappeared, but because it had been acknowledged. At one point, Richard cleared his throat and said quietly that he had been thinking about the word sacrifice. He admitted that he had used it carelessly, as if love were a transaction rather than a choice. He said he understood now that raising a child was not something to be measured against what might have been. Susan added that they had confused familiarity with closeness, assuming that physical distance equaled emotional loss. Emily listened without defensiveness. She did not need them to repeat apologies endlessly. She needed them to understand, and they did. The following afternoon, they visited her office building. Emily showed them the conference room where she had presented her first major campaign. She spoke confidently about future plans, about possible promotions, about goals that extended beyond the next holiday. Her parents stood beside her, not as supervisors of her life but as witnesses to it. When the weekend ended and they returned to the airport, there was no pressure for her to promise frequent visits or reconsider her choices. Instead, Susan told her that home would always be open but that they trusted her to define what home meant. Richard hugged her once more and said he was proud of the woman she had become, not because she stayed close, but because she chose her path with clarity. As Emily watched their plane depart on the digital board inside the terminal, she felt a sense of balance she had not known before. The notebook she had left behind months earlier remained in her childhood bedroom, but its purpose had been fulfilled. It had not broken her family. It had corrected it. Back in Chicago, she returned to her apartment and stepped onto the balcony overlooking the river, the skyline steady and bright against the evening sky. The distance between her and Ohio remained nearly 300 miles, measured in highways and state lines, but it no longer represented rejection. It represented growth. And for the first time, the life she was building and the family she came from existed without competing for space inside her.